I've always lived quietly. Angela Bennett, 58, a woman who has learned to keep her expectations low and her head down. Life has taught me that nothing grand comes my way. When Paul died 5 years ago, I didn't expect things to improve. He was the heart of our little family, and when he left, the silence in the apartment felt more profound than any noise could. I had my son, Jack, of course. The one bright thread in my life. Even though we weren't close, I knew he loved me. Still, the distance between his world and mine was undeniable. He had married Laura Taylor, a woman from old money, a world I had never really understood. And as much as I tried to fit in, it always felt like I was wearing someone else's clothes, too tight, too unfamiliar. It wasn't so much that Laura ever overtly insulted me, but her family, they had their way of making sure I knew I wasn't one of them. The little things, where I sat at family dinners, the awkward pauses in conversation when I spoke, the cool smiles, the way they never truly saw me. It made every visit feel like a stage I wasn't meant to be on. One year, Jack invited me to the family Christmas party. I could tell this meant a lot to him. It was a chance for me to finally prove that I could be part of their world. I decided to make the best of it, to present myself in a way that might finally make them see me. So, I spent days preparing, new clothes, making sure my hair was just right, that I had everything down to the smallest detail. This was my moment. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. The night of the party, I was ready. Or at least, I thought I was. The snow had started falling early in the afternoon, light at first, but as the day wore on, the flakes turned heavier, the wind picking up. Jack had warned me to leave early, but I wasn't one to rush. I thought, if I dressed right, if I arrived with just the right amount of grace, maybe I could change their perception of me. I could show Laura's family that I wasn't some simple woman from a small town. That I belonged. But as I stepped out the door of my apartment, the snowstorm that had been so gentle earlier became a wall of ice. The snowstorm swept through the streets, slapping against the car windows, piling up on the sidewalks. I couldn't help but feel the weight of it on my chest, as if the storm itself was pushing against my every step. I drove slowly, my hands tight on the steering wheel, the windshield wipers barely able to keep up with the blizzard. Every few minutes, I'd check the time on the dashboard, silently praying I would still make it. But the roads were treacherous, the snow piling higher with every passing second. I was late. I knew I was. I arrived at Jack and Laura's house an hour later than I had planned, the place already buzzing with the hum of Christmas music and conversation inside. The grand entrance was adorned with twinkling lights, tall trees with extravagant decorations, and wreaths that screamed wealth, status, and sophistication. I stood outside for a moment, watching the lights flicker as I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The cold air burned my cheeks, but it was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. Inside, laughter spilled from the open windows. The warmth from the house seemed so far away, as though I could never truly reach it. I walked up the stone path to the front door, the snow crunching beneath my boots, my feet dragging with the weight of expectation. I reached for the doorbell, my finger trembling slightly as I pressed it. The sound echoed faintly through the night air, and within moments, the door swung open. Jack stood there, his face bright with a welcoming smile, but even through his kindness, I could see the flicker of concern in his eyes. He had hoped for me to be there sooner, and I knew I was only adding to his stress. He kissed me on the cheek, his greeting warm, but there was a nervousness in his posture, a subtle hint of discomfort I couldn't ignore. "Mom, you made it," he said, trying his best to sound cheerful, but I could tell that the strain in his voice didn't match the joy that Christmas was supposed to bring. "I'm sorry I'm late, Jack." "The storm," I began, but he cut me off with a soft wave of his hand. "It's okay. Don't worry about it," he said, ushering me inside. "Everyone's already inside. Let's get you settled." As I stepped into the house, the warmth immediately enveloped me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a world that didn't belong to me. The air was thick with perfume, expensive champagne, and the soft hum of conversations that I couldn't quite reach. I stood for a moment in the entryway, taking in the grand decorations, the elegant silverware on the table, the laughter spilling from the adjacent room. It was all so perfect, so pristine. But it wasn't my world. I had never belonged here. Jack led me into the living room, where the Taylor family and their friends were gathered. Laura stood by the fire, looking every bit the part of the polished, sophisticated woman she was. Her dress, a deep red silk, hugged her frame, and her laughter seemed to float effortlessly from her lips, like a melody everyone wanted to hear. The room grew quieter as I entered, and I could feel their eyes shift towards me, as though my presence was a disruption to the delicate balance they had spent so much time perfecting. They weren't rude. No one openly looked down on me, but the way they paused, the way their glances lingered just a little too long, it was clear. I didn't fit. Laura's smile was tight as she walked over to me, her voice dipped in politeness but missing the warmth that Jack always gave me. "Angela, you finally made it. You're looking well," she said, her tone so measured, so controlled. "Thank you, Laura," I said, smiling politely in return, even though I could feel the sting of her words. The polite niceties were like a cloak, hiding the discomfort beneath. Jack's hand rested briefly on my shoulder, offering a silent comfort. "Mom, let's get you something to drink. Laura, do you mind if we grab a drink for her?" "Of course," Laura replied, but her eyes barely met mine as she turned back to her conversation with the other guests. The room seemed to shift around me, as if I were standing in the middle of a play and I had missed my cue. The awkward silence that followed made my chest tighten even more. As Jack led me to the bar area, I couldn't help but glance around at the guests, polished, perfect, dressed in ways that made me feel small. The way they laughed effortlessly, shared stories of trips to exotic destinations, their children attending elite schools, their lives filled with privilege and ease. I couldn't help but feel out of place, like a puzzle piece that just didn't fit into the picture. Jack handed me a glass of wine, his brow furrowed slightly as he observed me. "Mom, you okay?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," I said quickly, not wanting to ruin his night. "Just a little tired from the drive." "Don't worry, you're here now. That's all that matters," he said with a smile, but I could tell it wasn't the smile of someone who believed everything was fine. As we returned to the others, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The conversations resumed, but the looks remained, the subtle glances exchanged across the room. I felt it, the coldness, the distance between me and everyone else. It was as though I was invisible, a shadow standing at the edges of a world I could never truly belong to. Laura made a passing comment about the storm, and before I could respond, she turned to one of the other guests, a woman in a sharp suit, and continued her conversation as if I were no longer there. The warmth of the fire seemed to evaporate, leaving only the uncomfortable chill that settled in my bones. It was at that moment that I realized, they would never accept me. They had already decided I wasn't part of their world, no matter how hard I tried. But what stung the most, what truly hurt, was that it wasn't just Laura or her family, it was Jack, too. The way he stood with me, but kept his distance, his body language betraying the divide between us. He wasn't overtly cruel, but his actions spoke louder than any words ever could. At that moment, I realized that this world, this perfect, polished world of Laura and her family, wasn't for me. It never would be. I took a long sip of the wine Jack had handed me, hoping the warmth from the alcohol would settle my nerves, but it didn't. It just made everything feel even more surreal, like I was floating outside my own body, watching this performance unfold around me. The laughter, the conversation, the effortless charm of the guests, it was all happening in a world that I didn't belong to. I couldn't help but feel small, invisible, unseen. I had hoped for so much, for validation, for recognition, for a place in their world. But instead, I felt more distant than ever. Like a forgotten guest who was merely a formality, an afterthought. As the night wore on, the gap between me and everyone else seemed to widen. I sat at the far end of the table, away from the main conversation, just like always. Laura's cold smile, Jack's distracted glances, none of it felt real anymore. It was all a performance, a show I wasn't meant to be part of. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, suffocating me. And that's when I realized something crucial. This life, this world, they were never going to accept me. And I couldn't keep trying to fit into a place that didn't want me. The next few minutes seemed to blur by in a haze. I sat, forced a smile, and pretended to enjoy the evening, but every passing second felt like an eternity. The conversations swirled around me, but I was outside of them, disconnected. The laughter echoed in the background, but I couldn't join in. I wasn't part of their world. I had tried so hard, so many times, but it had become clear that I was never going to be anything more than an outsider. Jack's laughter rang out from across the room, a sound that once filled me with warmth. But tonight, it stung. It wasn't the easy, loving laughter I'd always known. No, tonight, it felt like a mask, something he wore to keep up appearances. I had seen him glance at Laura a few times, his expression uncertain, his smile forced. It was as if he was caught between two worlds, the world of his mother, and the world of his wife and her family. And in that moment, I realized just how alone I had become. I looked around at the other guests. They were effortlessly elegant, sipping champagne, exchanging stories of their latest travels, their children's achievements, their perfect, curated lives. I had nothing to offer them, nothing that could compare to their glossy, polished existence. I didn't belong here. I never had. The weight of my own insignificance pressed down on me, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I tried to push it away, but it grew stronger, a wave of emotion threatening to drown me. I wasn't just a stranger in their world. I was invisible. I had been invisible for so long, even to my own son. And tonight, it felt like a cruel reminder that I would always be that way. "Angela, is everything okay?" Jack's voice broke through my thoughts. I looked up to see him standing in front of me, his brow furrowed with concern. He had noticed my silence. I must have looked as lost as I felt. "I'm fine, Jack," I said, trying to force a smile. "Just tired from the drive. I didn't mean to disrupt the evening." "You're not disrupting anything," Jack said quickly, his voice too soft, too uncertain. "It's just, well, Laura was hoping to introduce you to some of her friends. We have a few people here from the business world, you know. It's important to make a good impression." I nodded, the weight of his words settling in like a stone in my stomach. He didn't say it outright, but I heard the implication loud and clear. This was their world, and if I wanted to be a part of it, I had to play by their rules. The rules of money, status, and power. The rules of a world where people like me were never truly seen. I had tried. I had tried so hard to fit in, to make them see me, to prove that I was worthy of being accepted. But no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I always felt like I was on the outside looking in. "I understand, Jack," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be fine." "Really?" Jack didn't look convinced, but he gave me a small, reassuring smile. "I'll check on you later, okay?" I nodded again, watching him walk away, his attention already shifting back to the group. He was just as trapped in this world as I was, but in a way, he had already accepted it. He had already chosen Laura and her family. I wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, he had outgrown me. I had become a relic of a past that no longer fit into his new life. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a ghost, fading into the background. I watched as Jack and Laura mingled with their friends, laughing and chatting, their faces glowing with the kind of happiness I could never seem to reach. I sat at the far end of the room, nursing my drink, pretending to be part of the scene, but all the while knowing I was invisible. Eventually, the dinner began. The long table was set with fine china, crystal glasses, and silverware that gleamed under the soft lighting. I took my seat at the far end, as usual, away from the main conversation. I watched as Laura and Jack sat at the head of the table, surrounded by their guests. They looked so comfortable, so at ease in each other's company. And I felt so out of place, like an unwanted guest at my own son's celebration. The meal was delicious, of course. Everything about this night was perfect, the food, the wine, the atmosphere. But none of it mattered. Because it wasn't my world. It never had been. And as the night dragged on, I realized something that I had been avoiding for far too long. I couldn't keep living this way. I couldn't keep pretending that I mattered to these people when I knew in my heart that I didn't. As dessert was served, I pushed my plate aside, suddenly no longer hungry. I looked around the room, trying to find something familiar, something that could anchor me in this strange world. But there was nothing. There was no warmth, no comfort. Just the cold, calculating glances from Laura's family, the polite but distant smiles, the undercurrent of judgment that I had come to expect. It was then that I realized, this was never going to change. No matter how hard I tried, would always be an outsider. My son, the one person who was supposed to love me unconditionally, had already chosen this world over me. I had already lost him. I had lost him the moment he married Laura and embraced the life she offered him. And I had been fooling myself if I thought that I could somehow change that. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. The ache of loneliness, the longing to belong, it all fell away, replaced by something else, anger. Anger at myself for allowing this to continue for so long. Anger at Jack for abandoning me, for making me feel invisible in my own life. Anger at Laura's family for never once seeing me as more than an inconvenience. And most of all, anger at myself for not seeing the truth sooner. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Jack looked up, startled by my movement. "Mom? Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. But I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I walked toward the door, my steps purposeful, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from this world, this life, before I lost myself completely. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face as I stepped outside, the snow still falling in heavy flakes, blanketing everything in white. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. The world felt different now. For the first time, I was seeing it clearly. And I realized, with a sense of finality, that I didn't need their approval. I didn't need to fit into their world. I had my own. And it was time I started living for myself, no one else. I walked through the snow, my boots crunching in the fresh powder, and as I did, I let go of the years of frustration, of trying to be someone I wasn't for people who didn't care. I had given them everything, my time, my love, my effort. But I wasn't going to give them any more. The streetlights flickered above me as I continued walking. The snow had covered everything, erasing the world as I knew it. It felt like a clean slate, like I had a chance to start over. I didn't know what was next, but I knew this, I wasn't going to live for them anymore. I could feel the quiet strength building inside me, the strength to finally take control of my own life. I didn't need their validation to be worthy. I didn't need their approval to move forward. For the first time in years, I wasn't bound by their expectations. And that felt like freedom. The cold air bit at my cheeks as I walked down the snowy street, the weight of the night's revelation still pressing heavily on my heart. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away, away from the stifling expectations, away from the people who had made me feel invisible for so long. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I moved through the quiet streets, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't quite catch. All I knew was that something inside me had shifted, something had broken free. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was starting to reclaim who I was. I had always been the quiet one, the one who sat at the far end of the table, the one who kept her thoughts to herself, too afraid to speak up, too afraid to ask for what I needed. But tonight, I realized how much of my life I had spent accommodating others, bending to their wills, sacrificing my own identity just to fit in. And I was done with that. My thoughts drifted to Jack. The hurt was sharp, but there was something deeper now, something that felt like a quiet resignation. He had chosen his life with Laura, his new family, his new world. And in doing so, he had left me behind, not in an obvious, cruel way, but in the quietest of ways. In the way he no longer made time for me, in the way he couldn't understand the life I led, in the way he let Laura's world swallow him whole. I had seen it happening slowly over the years, but tonight, it became crystal clear. Jack wasn't mine anymore. He belonged to her, to that world that would never accept me. And that's when it hit me, he wasn't the only one who had changed. I had too. I had spent so many years being the mother I thought I was supposed to be. The one who made sacrifices, who put others first, who stayed in the background, supporting everyone but never asking for anything in return. But now, I realized that I couldn't keep living like that. I couldn't keep pretending to be someone I wasn't, someone who didn't have a voice, someone who didn't have a place of her own. I had been invisible for far too long. As I continued walking through the snow, I thought about the years of quiet submission. I thought about the times I had stood in the shadows, watching as Jack and Laura and their friends made their way through life with all their privilege and wealth, while I remained on the periphery. And then I thought about the moments when I had tried to fit in, tried to prove myself worthy, tried to prove that I was just as important as they were. But the truth was, I had always known deep down that I would never be enough for them. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, would always be an outsider in their eyes. And now, I realized that I didn't need their approval anymore. I had spent so much time measuring myself against their standards, so much time trying to be someone I wasn't, that I had lost sight of who I truly was. I had let their world dictate my worth, and I was done with that. I had my own life, my own path to follow, and it was time for me to start living it. The snow was coming down harder now, the streetlights casting long, pale shadows across the white blanket covering the streets. The world around me felt quiet, still, like it was holding its breath. I slowed my pace and let the cold air fill my lungs, feeling the weight of it settle deep within me. I was no longer the woman I had been. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had finally found her voice. I walked for hours, my feet moving automatically, my mind racing with all the possibilities of what the future might hold. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of freedom, a sense of possibility. I didn't know exactly where I was headed, but I knew I was headed somewhere different. Somewhere that wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations. Eventually, my feet led me to a small park, the trees towering above me, their branches heavy with snow. I sat down on a bench, feeling the cold metal beneath me, the snowflakes falling gently around me like a blanket of soft, white petals. I closed my eyes and let the silence wash over me, the stillness of the night calming my racing thoughts. For a long time, I just sat there, breathing in the cold air, letting it fill me up, letting it clear the fog in my mind. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I knew something had to change. I had to change. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid of it. The woman I had been, the one who stayed in the background, the one who sacrificed everything for others, was gone. She had been swallowed up by the expectations of others, by the world I had tried so hard to fit into. But now, she was gone, replaced by something new, something strong, something that would no longer bend to the will of others. I thought about the future, my future. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges, yes. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of them. I was ready to face whatever came next. I was ready to start living for myself, to build a life that was truly mine, not one defined by the opinions and expectations of others. The snow continued to fall, the world around me growing quieter and more peaceful with every passing second. I sat there for a long time, lost in thought, lost in the quiet rhythm of the world. And then, something shifted inside me. I knew what I had to do. I had to take control. I had to stop waiting for permission. I had to stop trying to fit into a world that had never truly seen me. I had to create my own world, one that was built on my terms, on my values, on my dreams. I had spent so many years letting others dictate my worth, but no more. The time had come for me to take back my life. As I stood up from the bench, a sense of clarity washed over me. I didn't know exactly what the next chapter of my life would look like, but I knew one thing for certain, I was going to live it for me. No more pretending. No more sacrificing. No more fading into the background. I took one last look at the park, the snow-covered trees standing tall and proud around me, and then I turned and walked away. I didn't know where I was headed, but for the first time in years, I felt a sense of hope. And that hope was all I needed to take the first step into my new life. As I walked through the streets, the wind biting at my skin, I thought about all the possibilities. I was no longer tied down by the weight of expectations. I was free, free to do what I wanted, free to become who I was meant to be. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in my life, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It excited me. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. There would be moments of doubt, moments when I would wonder if I had made the right choice. But I also knew that I had to keep moving forward. I had spent so many years living for other people, trying to fit into a world that never truly saw me. It was time to stop. Time to start living for myself, time to start building a life that was truly mine. As I made my way down the snow-covered street, I felt a surge of determination. I was done being invisible. I was done living in the shadows. The world was mine now, and I was going to make it count. The world outside felt like a completely different place now. There was something almost magical about the snow-covered streets, the way the quiet of the night seemed to wash away the noise in my head. With every step I took, I felt lighter, as though the weight of years spent under the expectations of others was finally lifting from my shoulders. I didn't know where I was headed, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't matter. I had always been someone who lived with a plan, someone who stuck to routines. But tonight, I had decided that I would follow my instincts, listen to the quiet whisper in my heart that had been drowned out by everyone else's voices for far too long. I didn't have a destination in mind. I didn't have a clear path forward. But I felt something new, something I hadn't felt in years, hope. Hope that there was still a chance for me to live life on my own terms, to define my own future, to create a life that wasn't dictated by the opinions of others. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I realized that I was capable of making it happen. The wind howled as it whipped around me, but I didn't care. I embraced it, feeling the cool air against my skin, my senses coming alive. I could feel the rhythm of my heartbeat, steady and strong, as I walked through the empty streets, no longer worried about the judgment of others. I was free now, free from the constraints I had allowed to bind me. And that freedom, that exhilarating sense of possibility, filled every corner of my being. I walked for hours, my feet moving without any real purpose, but with a direction in my mind, forward. There was no turning back. I had made the decision to change my life, to stop waiting for things to happen and to start making them happen. I wasn't going to sit on the sidelines anymore, watching as others lived their lives and made their choices. I was going to be part of that life, in my own way. The streets were empty, but the world felt alive, alive with possibility, with change. The weight of years spent silently hoping that things would get better, that one day my life would be different, was finally starting to lift. I had spent so long waiting for someone else to validate my existence, to recognize my worth. But tonight, I realized that it was up to me to do that for myself. I had always been defined by my relationships, by my roles, wife, mother, daughter. But now, I was ready to define myself. I didn't need the approval of anyone else. I didn't need to be accepted into their world to feel worthy. I had my own worth, my own value, and it was time I started recognizing that. I wasn't going to let the judgments of others, their cold stares, or their indifference dictate my happiness anymore. As I walked, my thoughts wandered back to Jack. He had been my world for so long, my only anchor. But I had allowed him to slip away, to become absorbed in a life that didn't include me. I had done it for him, I told myself, to give him space, to let him have his own life. But now, I saw it for what it truly was, a sacrifice of my own happiness in the hope that he would notice me, that he would see me for who I was, that he would care. But it hadn't worked. The more I tried to fit into his world, the more he pulled away. I had been blind to it, too caught up in my own desire for validation, for acceptance. I had tried to be someone I wasn't, someone he could be proud of. But the truth was, I had lost myself in the process. I had spent so many years putting everyone else first. I had put Jack's needs before mine, Laura's needs before mine, everyone's needs before mine. I had bent over backwards to be what they wanted me to be, but it had only pushed me further into the background. I had forgotten who I was, what I wanted, what I needed. But now, I knew. I knew that I had to stop living for others. I had to start living for me. And that was a scary thought, one that sent a shiver through me. But it was also liberating. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. I didn't feel like I had to meet anyone's expectations but my own. The snow was coming down harder now, the streetlights casting long, pale shadows across the white blanket covering the streets. The world around me felt quiet, still, like it was holding its breath. I slowed my pace and let the cold air fill my lungs, feeling the weight of it settle deep within me. I was no longer the woman I had been. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had finally found her voice. I walked for hours, my feet moving automatically, my mind racing with all the possibilities of what the future might hold. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of freedom, a sense of possibility. I didn't know exactly where I was headed, but I knew I was headed somewhere different. Somewhere that wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations. Eventually, my feet led me to a small park, the trees towering above me, their branches heavy with snow. I sat down on a bench, feeling the cold metal beneath me, the snowflakes falling gently around me like a blanket of soft, white petals. I closed my eyes and let the silence wash over me, the stillness of the night calming my racing thoughts. For a long time, I just sat there, breathing in the cold air, letting it fill me up, letting it clear the fog in my mind. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I knew something had to change. I had to change. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid of it. The woman I had been, the one who stayed in the background, the one who sacrificed everything for others, was gone. She had been swallowed up by the expectations of others, by the world I had tried so hard to fit into. But now, she was gone, replaced by something new, something strong, something that would no longer bend to the will of others. I thought about the future, my future. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges, yes. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of them. I was ready to face whatever came next. I was ready to start living for myself, to build a life that was truly mine, not one defined by the opinions and expectations of others. The snow continued to fall, the world around me growing quieter and more peaceful with every passing second. I sat there for a long time, lost in thought, lost in the quiet rhythm of the world. And then, something shifted inside me. I knew what I had to do. I had to take control. I had to stop waiting for permission. I had to stop trying to fit into a world that had never truly seen me. I had to create my own world, one that was built on my terms, on my values, on my dreams. I had spent so many years letting others dictate my worth, but no more. The time had come for me to take back my life. As I stood up from the bench, a sense of clarity washed over me. I didn't know exactly what the next chapter of my life would look like, but I knew one thing for certain: I was going to live it for me. No more pretending. No more sacrificing. No more fading into the background. I took one last look at the park, the snow-covered trees standing tall and proud around me, and then I turned and walked away. I didn't know where I was headed, but for the first time in years, I felt a sense of hope. And that hope was all I needed to take the first step into my new life. As I walked through the streets, the wind biting at my skin, I thought about all the possibilities. I was no longer tied down by the weight of expectations. I was free, free to do what I wanted, free to become who I was meant to be. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in my life, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It excited me. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. There would be moments of doubt, moments when I would wonder if I had made the right choice. But I also knew that I had to keep moving forward. I had spent so many years living for other people, trying to fit into a world that never truly saw me. It was time to stop. Time to start living for myself, time to start building a life that was truly mine. As I made my way down the snow-covered street, I felt a surge of determination. I was done being invisible. I was done living in the shadows. The world was mine now, and I was going to make it count. The next few days were a blur of emotions, a whirlwind of thoughts that kept me awake at night. I had made the decision to change my life, to finally take control, but that didn't mean I knew what I was doing or where to go. For the first time in a long time, I felt lost. But this time, it wasn't the painful kind of lost I had felt for so many years. No, this felt different. It felt like an open field, endless and full of possibilities. I had walked away from the life I had spent years trying to fit into. I had walked away from the Christmas party, from Jack, from Laura, from everything I had allowed to define me. And now, I was standing at the edge of something new, something uncharted. The future lay before me like a vast, open landscape, and it was mine to shape. It was terrifying. And exhilarating. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what to do next. My apartment felt emptier than it ever had before, the silence echoing off the walls. I had always prided myself on my independence, but now that I was truly alone, I wasn't sure where to start. I could feel the weight of the years pressing down on me, the years of compromise, of giving up my own needs and desires to make room for everyone else. I had lost myself in the process. But now, I was determined to find her again. I didn't know where to start, so I began by doing the one thing I could control, my job. I had been working part-time at a local bookstore for years, something to fill the hours, something to make a little extra money. It wasn't glamorous, but it had been enough. At least, it had been enough until recently. Now, the thought of spending another day shuffling between shelves, sorting through old books that no one ever picked up, felt like a prison sentence. I wasn't made for this anymore. I hadn't realized how long I'd been putting off the idea of change. The bookstore was comfortable, safe even, but it was also a symbol of everything I had been holding on to. It represented the small, safe life I had created for myself after Paul died. It was a life I had settled into because it was easy, because it didn't require me to face the truth about what I truly wanted. But now, as I stood on the precipice of something new, I realized I had been holding on to that life out of fear. Fear of change, fear of uncertainty, and most of all, fear of failure. But failure didn't scare me anymore. I had already failed at fitting into a world that wasn't mine. I had already failed at living for others, at living a life that wasn't true to myself. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. On a whim, I decided to visit Leonora Shaw, the wealthy woman I had met during the snowstorm. Our brief encounter had left a lasting impression on me, and I had been thinking about her ever since. She was everything I wasn't, confident, composed, unapologetically herself. I wondered if she could teach me how to be like that. Maybe she could help me figure out what I was supposed to do next. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my future didn't have to be defined by my past. I didn't need to stay stuck in a rut, in a life that no longer fit. Leonora had shown me that there were other ways of living, ways that didn't require constant compromise, ways that didn't involve shrinking to fit into someone else's mold. It was time to make a change. And maybe, just maybe, Leonora was the key to unlocking that change. I picked up my phone and dialed her number, my fingers trembling slightly as I pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring, her voice as warm and inviting as I remembered. "Angela. I'm so glad you called," she said, her tone genuine. "How are you?" "I'm doing better," I said, my voice hesitant at first. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night. And I've realized that I need to make a change. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I was wondering if you could help me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I wondered if I had overstepped somehow. But then Leonora spoke again, her voice reassuring. "Of course, Angela. I'd be happy to help. Why don't you come by my office tomorrow morning? We can talk about it more." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had taken the first step, and it felt like I was finally heading in the right direction. The next morning, I made my way to Leonora's office, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew one thing: I was ready. Ready to stop waiting for permission. Ready to take control. And ready to start living for myself. Her office was located in a sleek, modern building in the heart of the city. The walls were lined with glass windows, and the entire space was bathed in natural light. It was nothing like my small, modest apartment. The contrast made me feel like a fish out of water, but at the same time, it made me realize just how much I wanted something different. When I stepped inside, Leonora greeted me with a smile that made me feel like I belonged. "Angela, it's so good to see you," she said warmly, motioning for me to sit down across from her. "Tell me, what's on your mind?" I took a deep breath and began to speak, sharing with her the turmoil I had been feeling. How I had spent years living for others, how I had felt invisible, and how, in the wake of everything that had happened with Jack and Laura, I was finally ready to change my life. "I don't know where to start," I admitted. "But I feel like I need a fresh start. I need to build a life that's truly mine." Leonora listened intently, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished speaking, she sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Angela, you're not alone in feeling that way. I think we all reach a point in our lives when we realize that we've been living for others, that we've been putting ourselves last. It's never too late to make a change." Her words resonated deeply within me. She was right. It wasn't too late. I had spent far too long waiting for things to change on their own, but the truth was, I had to be the one to make it happen. "I'd like to help you," Leonora continued. "But first, you have to believe that you're worth it. You have to believe that you deserve to live for yourself, that you deserve to make your own choices." I nodded slowly, absorbing her words. I wasn't sure how long it would take for me to truly believe it, but I was willing to try. I was willing to make that change. We spent the next few hours talking about what my future could look like, brainstorming ideas for a new career, ways to rediscover my passions, and strategies for building a life that felt fulfilling. It was a lot to process, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. As I left Leonora's office later that afternoon, something inside me shifted. I wasn't the same woman who had walked in earlier that day. I had a plan, a direction. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like I could take it on. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. I would face setbacks and challenges, but I knew that I was ready to face them head on. The first step had been taken, and the rest would follow. I had finally stopped living for others. And for the first time in a long time, I was living for me. The following weeks were a blur of emotions, a whirlwind of thoughts that kept me awake at night. I had made the decision to change my life, to finally take control, but that didn't mean I knew what I was doing or where to go. For the first time in a long time, I felt lost. But this time, it wasn't the painful kind of lost I had felt for so many years. No, this felt different. It felt like an open field, endless and full of possibilities. I had walked away from the life I had spent years trying to fit into. I had walked away from the Christmas party, from Jack, from Laura, from everything I had allowed to define me. And now, I was standing at the edge of something new, something uncharted. The future lay before me like a vast, open landscape, and it was mine to shape. It was terrifying. And exhilarating. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what to do next. My apartment felt emptier than it ever had before, the silence echoing off the walls. I had always prided myself on my independence, but now that I was truly alone, I wasn't sure where to start. I could feel the weight of the years pressing down on me, the years of compromise, of giving up my own needs and desires to make room for everyone else. I had lost myself in the process. But now, I was determined to find her again. I didn't know where to start, so I began by doing the one thing I could control, my job. I had been working part-time at a local bookstore for years, something to fill the hours, something to make a little extra money. It wasn't glamorous, but it had been enough. At least, it had been enough until recently. Now, the thought of spending another day shuffling between shelves, sorting through old books that no one ever picked up, felt like a prison sentence. I wasn't made for this anymore. I hadn't realized how long I'd been putting off the idea of change. The bookstore was comfortable, safe even, but it was also a symbol of everything I had been holding on to. It represented the small, safe life I had created for myself after Paul died. It was a life I had settled into because it was easy, because it didn't require me to face the truth about what I truly wanted. But now, as I stood on the precipice of something new, I realized I had been holding on to that life out of fear. Fear of change, fear of uncertainty, and most of all, fear of failure. But failure didn't scare me anymore. I had already failed at fitting into a world that wasn't mine. I had already failed at living for others, at living a life that wasn't true to myself. I wasn't going to make that mistake again. On a whim, I decided to visit Leonora Shaw, the wealthy woman I had met during the snowstorm. Our brief encounter had left a lasting impression on me, and I had been thinking about her ever since. She was everything I wasn't, confident, composed, unapologetically herself. I wondered if she could teach me how to be like that. Maybe she could help me figure out what I was supposed to do next. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my future didn't have to be defined by my past. I didn't need to stay stuck in a rut, in a life that no longer fit. Leonora had shown me that there were other ways of living, ways that didn't require constant compromise, ways that didn't involve shrinking to fit into someone else's mold. It was time to make a change. And maybe, just maybe, Leonora was the key to unlocking that change. I picked up my phone and dialed her number, my fingers trembling slightly as I pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring, her voice as warm and inviting as I remembered. "Angela. I'm so glad you called," she said, her tone genuine. "How are you?" Not because I wanted to go back to the way things had been, but because I wanted closure, because I wanted to offer him a window into my life now, the life I had worked so hard to rebuild. I had learned to live for myself, but Jack had been a part of that journey, and I realized that in order to fully release the past, I needed to make peace with it. So one evening, I sat down again at my desk, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the drawer where the letter lay. I reread every word, feeling the raw emotion of that time when I had written it. It felt strange, almost foreign, to be in that space again, but I understood that this was something I needed to do for myself. I needed to take that final step. I took a deep breath and picked up my pen. I didn't need to explain myself, I didn't need to make excuses for the past. I simply needed to be honest. I needed to tell Jack the truth, not about how I had been hurt, but about who I had become, and what I was doing with the life he had once been a part of. "Dear Jack," I wrote, each word filled with a sense of finality that I hadn't anticipated. "I know it's been a long time since we spoke. A lot has changed for me, and I'm sure it has for you, too. I've spent a long time reflecting on our relationship and the things that were left unsaid. I've spent years trying to live up to a standard that wasn't mine, trying to fit into a life that didn't suit me. But I've learned something important, Jack. I've learned that I am enough, just as I am. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm living my truth." The words came easier now. There was no bitterness, no anger, just acceptance. I'm not writing this letter because I want things to go back to the way they were. I'm writing this because I've come to terms with the fact that our paths have changed, and that's okay. I've learned that I can't control what happens between us, but I can control how I move forward. And I want you to know that I'm okay. I'm doing well. I'm finding joy in things that I had forgotten about, and I'm learning how to be happy with who I am, independent of anyone else. I paused for a moment, reflecting on the years that had passed, on all the missed opportunities and the moments I had spent waiting for something that never came. But now, I was ready to let go. I don't know what comes next for us, Jack. I don't know if we can go back to what we had, but I do know that I need to be true to myself now. I need to live my life, not for anyone else, but for me. I hope you understand that, and I hope that one day, we can find our way back to each other. But I need to do this for me. And I need to let you do this for you. I signed the letter and folded it carefully, my hands shaking with both relief and uncertainty. I wasn't sure what would happen after I sent it, but somehow, writing it felt like a release. I had said everything I needed to say, even if I didn't know what to do with it just yet. But in that moment, I realized that I wasn't waiting for his approval anymore. I wasn't waiting for him to validate my existence. I was finally validating myself. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the blank page in front of me, reflecting on how far I had come. I had started writing again, something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I felt a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't sure how everything would unfold, but I knew I was no longer afraid. I wasn't afraid to face the unknown, to step into the future that I was creating for myself. I had always been defined by others, by the roles I had played as a mother, a wife, a daughter. But now, for the first time in years, I was defining myself, and that felt like a revelation. I was finally standing in my truth, and the world seemed full of possibility. The days that followed felt different. There was an energy about them, a new sense of purpose. I started working more on my writing, getting feedback from Paul, who had continued to be a wonderful mentor. I also began seeking out new opportunities, ones that aligned with my vision for my future, not just the ones I thought I should pursue. My confidence was growing, not from the validation of others, but from the internal knowledge that I was worthy of a life I designed. As the weeks turned into months, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. It hadn't been easy, and the road hadn't always been smooth, but I had learned to trust myself again. I had learned to step into the woman I was meant to be, not the woman I had tried to be for others, but the woman I had always been deep down, waiting to be discovered. And one day, as I sat at my desk, typing the final chapters of my novel, I realized something that took me by surprise. The letter to Jack, the one I had never expected to send, had become a moment of true closure. I had finally released the past. I had finally forgiven myself for the years I had spent living for others. And in doing so, I had opened myself up to the future, one where I was free to be exactly who I was. I didn't need anyone's approval to be happy. I didn't need to fit into anyone's world. My world was mine to shape, and I was done waiting for permission. As the months rolled on, the quiet progress of my life became something almost miraculous. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden flashes of insight. Instead, there was an accumulation of small victories that, over time, added up to something far greater than I had ever anticipated. I wasn't the same person who had sat at that table, unsure of my worth and questioning my future. I was evolving, growing into a version of myself that was grounded in truth and authenticity. And the transformation wasn't just internal, it began to reflect outwardly in the life I was building. One of the most significant shifts occurred in my approach to work. Writing had become an essential part of my life, and the novel Paul and I had been working on was nearing completion. The more I wrote, the more I found myself diving deeper into the world I was creating on the page. It was cathartic, revealing parts of myself I hadn't been aware of. Writing was no longer just a hobby, it was my calling, my purpose. At the same time, I was actively seeking opportunities to grow my career. I reached out to editors, agents, and other writers. I wasn't waiting for someone to come find me, I was putting myself out there, even though the fear of rejection still lingered. But with every rejection, there was a sense of resilience that I had never known before. I no longer saw setbacks as evidence of failure but as opportunities to learn and grow. I had come to understand that rejection didn't define me, it was simply a part of the process. Each rejection was another step closer to success. Then one day, I received an email that would change everything. It came from a well-known literary agent, someone I had only dreamed of working with. She had read my manuscript and was impressed with my writing. She wanted to meet with me. I sat at my desk for a long moment, staring at the screen. It felt surreal. Was this really happening? After years of self-doubt, of putting my writing and my dreams on the back burner, someone finally saw potential in me. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just the manuscript they were interested in. It was me, the woman who had found the courage to pursue her passion, no longer waiting for permission, no longer living in fear of not being good enough. I set up the meeting with the agent, my heart pounding with both excitement and nerves. I had been living in a bubble of self-reflection, focused so intensely on my own growth that I hadn't thought much about how others would see me now. But here I was, facing an opportunity to be validated for the first time in years. This was the moment I had been working toward, the moment when everything could change. The meeting was held at a sleek office in the city. The agent, a tall woman with sharp features and an air of confidence, greeted me warmly. We sat in her office, which was decorated with modern art and shelves of books, a symbol of the very world I had been dreaming of entering. I didn't expect the meeting to be easy, and it wasn't. It was intense, with questions about my writing, my motivations, and my journey. She wanted to know everything, how I had come to write this novel, what inspired me, and what my long-term goals were. She was thorough, almost clinical in her approach, but as I spoke, I realized that I wasn't just talking about my book. I was talking about myself, about the woman I had become through this process, the woman who had learned to trust herself, who had pushed through fear and rejection, who had carved out a life that was all her own. When the meeting finally ended, she told me that she was interested in representing me. I was stunned. I felt like I had just crossed a threshold into a new world, a world where my dreams were within reach. But more than that, I realized something even more important. I had already won. I had already succeeded in the hardest part, becoming the person who was brave enough to take that first step. The rest was just a natural progression, a result of the work I had put in and the growth I had achieved. In the following weeks, things began to move quickly. The agent helped me polish my manuscript, and we worked together to pitch it to publishers. It wasn't an easy road. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was doing the right thing, when the weight of this new reality felt too overwhelming. But I kept pushing forward, reminding myself that I had come this far, and that I deserved this. I deserved to be heard. Eventually, the book was picked up by a publisher. The news came on a chilly morning, and when I read the email confirming the deal, I felt as though the ground beneath me shifted. The feeling was surreal, like something that had seemed so out of reach was finally mine. My book was going to be published. My story was going to be shared with the world. The process was exciting, but it was also overwhelming. There were edits to be made, cover designs to approve, and marketing materials to consider. But through it all, I held on to one truth: I had done it. I had stepped into a future I had once thought was impossible. I wasn't just writing for myself anymore, I was writing to share a piece of who I was with others. The fear that had once gripped me in every decision I made had slowly dissipated, replaced with a quiet confidence that I hadn't known I was capable of. As the book release date drew closer, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. It wasn't just the success of being published that had transformed me, it was everything that had led up to it. It was the hours of self-reflection, the quiet moments of doubt, the work that had pushed me out of my comfort zone, and the courage to keep going even when things seemed uncertain. The life I had once lived, the life that was defined by other people's expectations and demands, seemed like a distant memory. I had walked away from that life, not because I hated it, but because I knew it wasn't the life I was meant to live. I had created a new reality, one where I was the author of my own story. In the months that followed the book's release, the response was more positive than I could have imagined. Readers connected with my words, and reviews were overwhelmingly kind. There was a sense of fulfillment that came from knowing that my work had touched others, that my vulnerability had allowed people to see themselves in my writing. But even more rewarding than the external success was the internal transformation. I had found my voice, my courage, and my confidence. I had built a life that was true to me, a life I could look at without regret. I no longer felt invisible, no longer felt like I was living in the shadows of others. I had stepped into the light, and I was shining in ways I had never thought possible. The future was still uncertain, of course. There would always be challenges, always be moments of doubt. But I had learned something invaluable. I had the power to shape my life, and I was capable of anything I set my mind to. I had proven that to myself, and that was the greatest victory of all. And so, I moved forward, ready for whatever came next. Because now, I knew that I had the strength to face it. I had not only survived the hardest years of my life, but I had emerged from them stronger and more determined than ever. The road ahead was mine to create, and I would do it on my terms. As I sat in front of my computer one evening, working on a new project, I smiled to myself. The old Angela, the one who feared taking risks, the one who couldn't find her own voice, was gone. She had been replaced by a woman who understood her worth, who had finally learned to trust herself. The future was still uncertain, but that was part of the adventure. I was no longer afraid. I was ready to live it fully.